The prairie was quiet, the kind of profound silence that settles over the land after a violent storm. It was a weighted stillness, a moment when the world itself seemed to hold its breath, listening for what the heavens might send next. Garrett rode slowly, his horse picking its way carefully through the sucking mud of the trail. He kept his hat pulled low, a futile gesture against the lingering, ghost-like drizzle that beaded on the brim. His gaze was fixed, constantly scanning the endless horizon where the bruised purple sky met the emerald-green earth, searching for any sign of trouble. He'd been out since the first hint of dawn, checking the long stretches of his fences, ensuring the night symphony of thunder and wind hadn't spooked his cattle into a panicked stampede. The air was thick and heavy, rich with the primal scent of rain-soaked soil and the delicate perfume of crushed wildflowers. For a fleeting moment, a sense of peace settled over him, a rare and welcome feeling in a life carved from hardship. But then he heard it. A sound so alien in the vast emptiness it seemed to tear a hole in the silence. It was a voice, a woman's, thin and sharp with desperation, carried to him on the mournful wind. "Please, not again." The words were a mere whisper, so faint he almost dismissed them as a trick of the wind whistling through the tall grass. He reined in his horse, the leather creaking in the quiet, and strained to listen. The world fell silent again, save for the drip of water from his hat and the soft snort of his mount. He was about to nudge the horse forward when it came again, clearer this time. A plea, broken and raw, shattered by a grief so profound it felt like a physical blow. Garrett's heart gave a heavy thud against his ribs. This was no imagining. He turned his horse, urging it off the muddy trail and into the tall, rain-soaked grass that slapped against his legs. He followed the sound, a phantom thread pulling him toward the old cottonwood grove that stood like a lonely sentinel on the plains. There, he found her. She was kneeling in the mud, her dark hair plastered to her face in wet strands, her simple dress torn at the shoulder and stained with earth. She was clutching a small bundle to her chest, rocking back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion of unbearable sorrow, her shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound. Garrett recognized her at once. Mai Lin. The Chinese widow who lived in a small, isolated cabin at the edge of town, a remnant of the railroad camps that had come and gone. Her husband, a quiet man named Wei, had been killed in a blasting accident 2 years prior, leaving her utterly alone in a community that viewed her with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and outright hostility. She was always silent, always kept to herself, a ghost in the general store who bought her meager supplies and vanished without a word, enduring the cold stares and muttered comments. Seeing her like this, not just quiet but shattered, not just alone but consumed by a visible, terrifying agony, twisted something sharp and unfamiliar in Garrett's chest. He dismounted, his boot sinking into the soft ground with a squelch. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to startle her. "Mai Lin," he called, his voice softer than he intended. She flinched violently, as if struck. Her head snapped up, and her grip tightened on the bundle in her arms until her knuckles were white. "Please, not again," she whispered, the words ragged, her voice barely more than a breath of air. "I cannot do this again." Garrett took another slow step forward and knelt beside her, the cold mud seeping through the knees of his trousers. "It's me, Garrett. From the ranch. You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." She looked up at him fully then, and the sight of her eyes made him catch his breath. They were wide and haunted, swimming in a depth of pain he couldn't begin to fathom. Her face, usually so composed and impassive, was a mask of grief, streaked with tears and rain. For a long moment, there was no recognition in her gaze, only raw, animal fear. Then, slowly, a flicker of awareness returned. She gave a small, shuddering nod, her breath catching in her throat in a series of gasping sobs. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her shoulder. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a rock in her sea of despair. Mai Lin just shook her head, a violent, jerky motion, as if the words were trapped behind a wall of tears. Garrett's gaze dropped to the bundle clutched so fiercely in her arms. It wasn't a baby, as he'd first feared. It was a child's coat, a small, quilted jacket of faded blue cotton, the kind a loving mother would stitch together to ward off the prairie chill. But there was no child. There was only the empty coat, held as if it were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, a lifeline in a drowning sea. Garrett's mind raced, connecting the scattered pieces of memory and rumor. He remembered the whispers that had swept through town last spring like a poison. A child gone missing. My Lynn's son. A quiet, 5-year-old boy named Dan. He remembered the town's brief, performative show of concern, the search parties that had dwindled after a day, the sheriff's cursory questions. And then he remembered the ugliness that followed. The whispers turned venomous, blaming her. Her otherness, her quiet nature, her strange customs, they were all twisted into evidence of negligence, or worse. He'd seen her in town afterward, a hollowed-out version of herself, her eyes vacant, her forced composure a shield against their judgment. He'd heard the cruel talk behind her back, the way people laid blame to soothe their own unease. My Lynn, he said again, his voice gentle but firm. You're not alone. Whatever happened, I'm here. I'll help. She shook her head again, fresh tears spilling down her pale cheeks. They said it was my fault, she choked out, the words a torrent of long-suppressed pain. They said I did not watch him. That I was careless. But I did. I swear, I did. I only turned my back for a moment. He just disappeared. Her voice broke completely, and she buried her face in the little coat, her body racked with a storm of sobs that tore through the quiet prairie. Garrett felt a profound and aching helplessness. The weight of her pain, a year old yet as raw as an open wound, settled over him like a shroud. He wanted to offer platitudes, to tell her it wasn't her fault, that the world was a cruel and arbitrary place, but he knew the words were empty, useless things. They couldn't fill the void left by a missing child. So he did the only thing he could. He sat with her in the mud and the mist, a silent, steady presence, and waited for the storm inside her to pass. After what felt like an eternity, her sobs began to quiet, subsiding into shuddering breaths. She finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, but with a new clarity in their depths. I keep seeing him, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Every time I close my eyes. I hear his laugh on the wind. I see his smile when I look at the wildflowers. And then I wake up, and he is gone. And I have to live it all over again, the moment he vanished. Garrett reached out and squeezed her hand, his own voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. You don't have to go through this alone, my Lynn. Not anymore. She looked at his hand covering hers, then back to his face. A flicker of something, not quite hope, but a fragile possibility of it, stirred in her eyes. For the first time, in that glimmer, Garrett saw the woman she must have been before tragedy had hollowed her out. He helped her to her feet, his arm steadying her as she swayed, her legs weak from exhaustion and grief. The rain had softened to a fine mist, and the prairie glistened under a soft, pearlescent morning light. He led her to his horse, moving at her pace, letting her cling to the child's coat. Her knuckles were bone-white, as if letting go would mean truly accepting her son was gone forever. The ride back to his ranch was conducted in a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves on wet earth and the distant, melodic call of a meadowlark. Garrett's mind churned with questions, but he bit them back. He knew, from his own quiet griefs, that sometimes the best help wasn't in questions or advice, but in simply being there, a steady presence when the world had crumbled to dust. At the ranch, he settled her in a chair by the hearth, wrapping a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. He brewed a pot of strong, black coffee, and the rich, comforting aroma slowly filled the small cabin. He set a steaming cup in her trembling hands. She stared into the dancing flames, her eyes distant, lost in a landscape of memory he could never visit. Garrett sat across from her, nursing his own cup, letting the silence stretch, giving her the space she needed. Finally, after a long while, she spoke, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear. It was a year ago. Today, she said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. I sent him to fetch a bucket of water from the well. He loved to help. He was only gone a minute, 1 minute. But when I looked up from my sewing, he was gone. I searched everywhere. I screamed his name until my throat was raw. She took a shuddering breath. The town, they helped, for a day. Then they stopped. They said he must have wandered off toward the river. That the current took him. She looked at him, her gaze sharp and intense. But I know Mayan. He was a careful boy. He was afraid of the river. He would not have left without telling me. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Garrett remembered the search. He remembered the way the town had rallied with a brief, self-congratulatory fervor, then how quickly their sympathy had curdled into suspicion and dismissal. He'd seen it before, how a community, faced with a tragedy it couldn't comprehend, needed a scapegoat. And the quiet, foreign woman was the easiest target. My Lin's hand shook, rattling the cup against its saucer. Every day since, I come out here. To the grove. It was his favorite place to play. I sit and I hope for a sign. Sometimes I think I hear his voice in the wind. Sometimes I see his face in my dreams. But every morning, I wake up, and he is still gone. She looked at Garrett, her eyes pleading, desperate. Please, not again. I cannot lose him again. I cannot live through this day one more time. Garrett's heart ached for her. He reached across the small table, his large, rough hand covering hers. You're not losing him, my Lin. Not while you remember him. Not while you keep his memory alive in your heart. She nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. I just wish I knew what happened. The not knowing, it is a different kind of death. I wish I could let him go, but I can't. Not until I know the truth. Garrett thought for a long moment, the cogs of his practical mind turning. Then he spoke, his voice soft but resolute. Maybe it's time to ask for help again. Maybe there's something we missed. Something everyone else overlooked because they weren't really looking. My Lin shook her head, fear flickering in her eyes. They will not listen. They think I am a crazy woman, lost in grief. They think I did something to my own son. Garrett's voice was firm, cutting through her fear. I'll listen. And I'll help you. We'll search together. And this time, we won't stop until we find the truth, whatever it is. A spark of hope ignited in my Lin's eyes, fragile but real. You would do that? After everything they said about me? Garrett nodded, his gaze unwavering. I know you, my Lin. I've seen you. I know your heart. And I know you loved your boy more than anything in this world. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet chores and gentle, halting conversation. My Lin helped where she could, her movement slow but filled with a renewed purpose. Garrett watched her, seeing the steel-like strength beneath the layers of sorrow, the incredible courage it took just to keep breathing, day after day. As evening fell, they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the vast sky in fiery shades of gold and rose. For the first time in a year, My Lin let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. And as the first stars blinked awake in the deep indigo above the prairie, Garrett made a silent promise to himself, and to her, to help find the answers she so desperately needed, no matter how long it took. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm a distant memory washed clean by brilliant sunlight and the cheerful music of birdsong. Garrett saddled his sturdiest horse and packed a satchel with bread, dried meat, a canteen of water, and a coil of rope. My Lin stood at the cabin door, the small blue coat folded neatly in her arms, her face pale but set with a quiet, fierce determination. Are you certain? She asked, her voice trembling just a little. Garrett gave a firm nod. We'll start at the well. We'll retrace every single step. If there's anything to find, we'll find it. They rode out together, the prairie stretching wide and impossibly green before them. At the old stone well near her abandoned cabin, My Lin dismounted and knelt, her fingers tracing the worn, moss-covered stones. He was right here, she whispered, her voice thick with memory. I turned my back for just one moment to thread my needle. Garrett didn't reply. He began to scan the ground, his eyes sharp and practiced, looking for anything out of place, anything the earth might have held onto for a year. The grass had grown tall, but near the base of the well, sheltered from the worst of the wind, he spotted a tiny flash of color. he crouched down, carefully parting the blades of grass. There, half buried in the damp dirt, was a small, faded red ribbon of silk. He picked it up and held it out to Mai Lin. Her breath caught in a sharp gasp. That was his, she breathed, her eyes wide. I tied it in his hair that morning to keep it from his eyes. It was from my wedding dress, hope and a terrible dread warred in her expression. It was proof. Proof he was here. Encouraged, Garrett widened his search, moving slowly, methodically. A few yards away, leading toward the river, he found what he was looking for, a set of footprints, nearly erased by a year of wind and rain, but still faintly visible in a patch of softer earth. They were small, the prints of a child. But beside them, pressed deep into the soil, were the unmistakable prints of a man's heavy boots. Deep and wide. Garrett's jaw tightened. He wasn't alone, he said, his voice a low growl. Mai Lin's hand shook as she clutched the coat. Who? Who would take Mayan? Why? Garrett shook his head, a cold anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. We're going to find out. They followed the faint trail of tracks, which wound through the tall grass not directly toward the river, but parallel to it, heading for a derelict line shack that had been abandoned years ago by the railroad. The trail vanished in the thicker brush, but Garrett's instincts pushed him onward. As they approached the dilapidated structure, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The door hung crookedly on a single hinge, groaning in the breeze. Stay here, he told Mai Lin, his voice low. He drew the pistol from his hip, the metallic click loud in the quiet air, and pushed the door open. The inside of the shack was dark and smelled of decay and damp earth. A single beam of light cut through a hole in the roof, illuminating a swirl of dust motes. At first, it looked empty. But as Garrett's eyes adjusted, his blood ran cold. In the far corner was a small pile of dirty straw. On the wooden wall above it were scratches, dozens of them, the kind a small, desperate child would make with a rock or a fingernail. Lying in the straw was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its paint worn away. Mai Lin, unable to wait, had followed him to the doorway. She let out a strangled cry. His bird, she whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. My way carved it for him. He never went anywhere without it. But that wasn't what made Garrett's heart hammer against his ribs. It was what he saw on the dusty floor. The boot prints of the large man were there. But beside them, scuffed and partially obscured, was a second, different set of prints. And in the corner, almost hidden by the straw, was a discarded branding iron. It wasn't for cattle. The mark on the end was a strange, unfamiliar symbol, a twisted knot. This wasn't a simple case of a child wandering off. This wasn't a random act. This was planned. Organized. And was not lost, he was taken. Suddenly, the sound of an approaching horse made them both freeze. Garrett spun around, raising his pistol, positioning himself in the doorway to shield Mai Lin. A grizzled, weather-beaten prospector rode into the clearing, leading a small, frightened boy by the hand. The boy looked up, his dark eyes wide and uncertain. His clothes were ragged, his face smudged with dirt, but it was him. It was an. Time seemed to stop. The world fell away, leaving only the sight of the child. Mama, he whispered, his voice small and hesitant. The blue coat fell from Mai Lin's arms. She ran, stumbling through the mud, dropping to her knees and gathering her son into a desperate, crushing embrace. She wept, not with sorrow, but with a joy so fierce and overwhelming it was painful to watch. She held him close, her face buried in his hair, the child's coat now pressed between them, a symbol of a nightmare that was finally over. Garrett watched, his own eyes stinging, his grip on the pistol loosening. The old prospector tipped his hat. Name's Barnaby. Found him at my camp upriver last night. Some fella had him, was treating him rough. When he saw me, he took off like a shot, left the boy behind. Figured he belonged to someone. Garrett strode over and shook the man's hand, gratitude flooding through him, too immense for words. You did more than you know. My Lin clung to her son, her sobs turning to a breathless, watery laughter as she checked him over, whispering to him in her native tongue words of love and relief. The boy, dazed but seemingly unharmed, buried his face in her neck, his small hands clutching the fabric of her dress as if he would never let go. Garrett knelt beside them, his voice gentle. "You're safe now. Both of you." The ride back to town was a world away from the silent, grief-stricken journey of the day before. And was nestled in my Lin's arms, exhausted but safe, the terrible weight of a year's grief finally lifting from her shoulders. The news spread through the town like wildfire. People emerged from their homes and shops, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and shame. Some offered stilted, awkward apologies. Others simply stood in silence, witnesses to the undeniable power of a mother's love and the quiet courage of a man who chose to believe her. That night, as the stars shone with a brilliant clarity over the prairie, my Lin sat on the porch of Garrett's cabin, her son asleep in her lap. She looked at Garrett, who was leaning against the porch rail, and her eyes shone with a gratitude so deep it needed no words. "Thank you," she whispered. "For believing in me. For not turning away when everyone else did." Garrett offered a small, rare smile, his heart full. "You never have to face anything alone again, my Lin. Not while I'm here." The truth of what had happened to him was still a dark shadow on the horizon, the second man, the strange brand, but it was a shadow they would face together. As the peaceful, endless prairie stretched out before them, Garrett knew he'd witnessed something more than just a reunion. He'd witnessed a miracle born from unyielding faith and the quiet, stubborn courage to keep hoping, even when the world seemed determined to break you.